Welcome back to Uncharted X. This is Ben, and I hope you are all well. In this video, we're going back to Egypt. Shocking, I know. To investigate some rarely seen and remarkable features of the ancient granite quarry at Aswan in Upper Egypt. In this part of the quarry, normally off-limits to tourists, there is evidence for something truly enormous having been removed. A single stone block that rivals, if not exceeds, the dimensions of the famous unfinished obelisk, a 1,200-ton monolith that is still in place and is the main attraction at the site. Not only that, however, but in this off-limits area, painted on the walls, is evidence that suggests that this colossal extraction might have been done long before the great dynastic Egyptian civilization ever began. I hope you'll join me as we explore these fascinating aspects of the ancient granite quarry, and just how they challenge our understanding of history. The Aswan quarry is only one of many like it in the region, but it's the only one open to tourism. It's a must-see location for anyone visiting Egypt. When you arrive at the site and you buy your ticket, the first thing that happens is you are crowded into a hotbox of a room and shown a 20-minute video, in which it's explained to you how everything here was achieved with nothing more than dolerite pounding stones, time, and human effort. The Aswan Quarry is the only tourist site in Egypt I know of that makes it mandatory for visitors to sit down and have what they're going to see explained to them in this way. And it can generate some giggling from those who have looked into the evidence here beyond a superficial level. The video you're shown primarily focuses on the unfinished obelisk and how it was carved via pounding stones, therefore explaining the infamous scoop marks that are visible everywhere around it. Not covered in the video is the fact that there were multiple methods of stone quarrying used here. One method is the classic wedge and chisel approach, which leaves behind a characteristic signature that looks like a dashed line in the stone. Indentations into the stone are chiseled in a line, then wedges of wood are hammered into them. The wood is watered, which forces it to expand, putting pressure on the stone. Then flint wedges, or in later periods iron wedges, are hammered down, with the goal of forcing the stone to split along the wedge line and leaving what looks like a dashed line behind. You can find the signature of this technique all over the stone and monuments of ancient Egypt, and it was a method used for many thousands of years, right up until recent times, in fact. It was even used on the granite of the incredible casing stones of the Middle Pyramid at Giza.
And I want to explain the precision of the rest of it, you know what I mean? It's like, alright, so fine, if they were to do that and split in half, and it's like, it's not going to be perfect though. It's not going to be flush this, you know what I mean? It's going to be garbage. It's going to be like, okay, it's cut in half.
That's why they want to quarry it, so they can make use of the flat surface. They want the flat surface.
Right.
Yeah. Because they can't make it.
They will, actually that's why you find lots of those. This will be the waste, because the piece that they are extracting from here is going to be thin from here and thick from down there. So they were actually aiming for this. And they will manually carve it until they make mill stone out of it.
Yeah.
This is most of what they... but it's not just during the Greco-Roman and the Coptic time when they used to make mill stones, but there is also, as I told you, from the 12th dynasty, which is the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BC.
This was done by the workmen of Ramses II of the 19th dynasty, who was quarrying the granite of the casing stones to take slabs for use on other sites. Why quarry raw stone for yourself when you can just take finished pieces from far older monuments? Interestingly, a geologist who was travelling with us in Egypt made an astute observation that connects the wedge and chisel method to the stone nub phenomenon found around the world. On many megalithic sites, we can find both large and small stone nubs, or protrusions, coming out of the blocks, and it's a mystery that's been explored by many researchers. If your quarrying method is wedge and chisel, with the aim to split stone blocks, then it's incredibly unlikely that you'll end up with a nub as a result. Wedge and chisel quarrying either splits the stone in a mostly straight line, or it fails, and only a chunk of stone is removed. A good example of a failure is seen here, when an attempt to split a slab from the huge megalithic granite blocks of the Aswan failed, leaving only the corner removed. You just don't get nubs from wedge and chisel quarrying, and it's a seemingly obvious connection when you think about it, but it's not one that I'd made before.
Yeah.
So if someone comes and says, well look, I can cut these because I can split rock, right? So if I'm going to split rock, am I messing up the video?
No.
So I'm going to split it. Yeah, I can split a rock like that by using coins and the chisels and go along the holes, right? So if I split a rock like that, I can't leave a nub. You cannot leave a nub.
If you split a rock?
You cannot leave the nub. It's flat. Follow me?
Well, yes, if it's so these aren't split, is what you're saying.
Or if they've been split, then honed down, then put it in
Then
place.
put in a nub, yeah.
And then
No, you're right,
leave a nub
yeah.
stand.
Yeah, there's some other quarrying technique in play here, not splitting.
There's at least one.
That's okay. Yeah,
what I mean?
I'm following you.
Yeah. So if anybody says, no, I can split, then you're right. Then tell me how you left
You
the
make it a
nub.
nub. Yeah. You know what?
That'll make people think.
Yeah.
So, how could the nubs have been formed? Many people speculate that they represent a sort of unfinished work. The stone wasn't fully dressed and the nubs were intended to be removed. They can't have been created in the first place by the commonly used wedge and chisel approach, so either they're a deliberate feature carved into the stone for some sort of purpose or function, or they're the result of a very different method of quarrying. It's probably no surprise that these nubs are also closely associated with the infamous scoop mark form of quarrying. They're often found in the same area, and even on the same stones. For example, if you examine the granite casing stones of the third pyramid at Giza, you will find both scoop marks and nubs. When it comes to the scoop marks, the best examples are found at the granite quarry in Aswan, and represent one of the enduring mysteries of this site. I've explored this phenomena in depth in a previous video. I'd recommend checking that out if you haven't seen it, as the scoop marks are very important to the central topic for this video. It's worth mentioning that there is a third quarrying technique in evidence at Aswan, beyond the scoop marks and the wedge and chisel approach. That of traditional chiseling, something done in the later periods of ancient Egypt, likely with long iron chisels that were hammered into the stone. Just keep on hammering away until you separate the desired block from the bedrock, and you can see the signature it leaves here. Despite all three of these techniques being visible at Aswan, the scoop marks are the only quarrying method that is discussed in the indoctrination video all tourists are forced to watch. As we know, the explanation given is that of pounding stones, a theory with more holes in it than a colander.
This is how they made them, apparently.
Watch out, you'll break it.
Perhaps this is because the scoop marks are associated closely with the most massive and impressive features in the quarry, like the 1,200-ton unfinished obelisk, and the claim that huge blocks like this can be extracted with nothing more than manpower, time, and a bunch of round rocks needs an authoritarian tone if it is to be believed. After all, there's nothing really mysterious about the other quarrying techniques. They have all been in use for thousands of years, and variations on them are still used today. They were evidently also used at Aswan for cutting decidedly smaller stone blocks, with no evidence to suggest that they played a role in extracting the obelisk. They were used to try and carve it up into smaller pieces, presumably much later on. It's an interesting observation. The dashed lines of wedge and chisel quarrying isn't used to create very large pieces in the first place, but it seems to have been frequently used to try and carve them up into smaller pieces later on. This is part of the mystery of the scoop marks, as the orthodox explanation for them makes it easily the most primitive technique, yet it's something that we only ever see on the most impressive or the most massive and megalithic of ancient achievements. During that same indoctrination video, the narrator also attempts to explain just how gigantic single pieces of stone were moved from the site. The video describes a harbour area of the quarry in which boats were docked and huge stones were loaded. This harbour area is what we're going to talk about today. It's normally forbidden to enter this area. I don't know why, but it's found directly outside of the entry buildings. Normally, you're shepherded around to the left to the walkway that leads up to the unfinished obelisk, but on one occasion our group just kind of walked down into the harbour area to take a look. Eventually we were chased out, but not before we had a chance to examine the walls and features here, and it was fascinating. Walking into the harbour area, you are confronted with what seems to be a large trench, and gazing at the walls here, it's clear that this area has been quarried with the scoop technique. And not only that, but it appears that a truly monumental piece of granite was removed. The outline of the piece is shown by the indented tops of the scoops, the ridges at the tops of the walls, probably the remnants of narrow trenches cut down into the stone, that then extended underneath the block at the bottom. Look at the dimensions of the walls at the end here where we're standing. The piece here, to my eye, seems larger in both width and height than that of the unfinished obelisk. When we examine the famous obelisk, its width can be established by the distance between the trenches on either side. At its widest part, its base, it measures 4.2 meters across. The width tapers down or narrows as the trenches go towards the top. Assuming that they wanted to remove a square section of stone, the trenches are only about 2/3 as deep as they need to be. Given obelisks generally have square sections, we can safely assume that its intended maximum height at its base as being around 4.2 meters also. Returning to the walls of the harbour, the height of the block that was removed here seems to have a larger cross-section than that of the obelisk. Even accounting for trenches and undercutting, to my eye this was a bigger piece, and it was, obviously, successfully extracted. A huge monolith, by any description. We only have access to most of one wall of the original trench that ran down the length of the piece, and a small part of the opposite wall at the base of the block. The majority of the stone that would have made up the other side of the excavation has all been quarried away over time. Looking at the ground level, where the block would have been undercut, there are odd notches and channels that are carved at regular intervals. To me, these are very interesting, as we're getting a look at what must have been some of the final stages of the quarrying process before extracting such an enormous stone. What was the purpose for these shapes? Perhaps the channels were needed for part of the mechanism used to lift the piece up out of its trench. This part of the extraction, lifting the block out of its trench, is a not inconsequential task, and when we consider the unfinished obelisk, this task is conspicuously left unaddressed by the standard model explanation. I've always wondered, exactly how would a Bronze Age culture manage to lift a 1,200-ton piece up out of its bed, which is on an angle, raise it at least 5 meters or more into the air, and then maneuver it over the rocky and uneven ground of the quarry? In my own research, as well as in several comments and emails, I've heard it proposed that perhaps the dolerite stone balls, which were found in large numbers on this site, the vast majority of them broken in half, might well have been used as primitive bearings beneath the large stone blocks as they were being released from the bedrock. The weight of blocks like the obelisk is certainly a better explanation for how you might split a dolerite sphere in half. Trying to split one through pounding alone was tested by British engineer Reginald Engelbeck, who excavated the site in 1922, and who found it to be basically impossible. The only way he managed to break one was by repeatedly hurling it down onto stone from a great height, eventually cracking a piece off. Returning to the so-called harbour area, we also get a sense for the length of the monolith, and again observe that it was truly massive, perhaps as long or even longer than the unfinished obelisk. We don't really know its true length, as the one long wall has been truncated by subsequent quarrying. My good friend and guide Yusuf Aswan made an interesting observation here, that the wall markings show some tapering down, which might suggest the block was intended for use as an obelisk. As previously mentioned, we can see the same tapering effect on the unfinished obelisk.
This was one massive body obelisk that was extracted. And you can see the sloping angle as well. It shows that it was probably yeah. Okay, then this look, then remember, this will be the part that runs under the obelisk.
Right, so these
So
are
the obelisk was probably, and you see this one here?
yeah.
This is where we would be walking. And this is the other part that moved under the obelisk. So it would be somewhere around between here and under the other side. So it's like 5 meters wide or something. Huge.
I mean, this could be the base for a statue, one of those giant statues. This could be a block from one of the giant statues.
Maybe, but if I look at the sloping angle here, looks like this is the base and this is an obelisk.
Yeah, oh true.
There wasn't one of this, and then maybe the one of this.
Maybe, according to the official story, at least they mentioned that obelisks are known since the old kingdom, so they're existing. Because I was actually talking about that online, and some dude came and said like, oh, obelisks were exclusively new kingdoms. So okay, go back to the books and keep reading. You didn't even get the official story right.
The size of the block, at least to me, seems like it might have been possibly intended for use as a statue. We know, without doubt, that gigantic single-piece granite statues weighing well in excess of 1,000 tons existed during ancient Egypt. Some of them were of a figure seated on a throne, and others were even standing. For example, here are the remnants of a single-piece composite quartzite statue found at Karnak. Just look at the immense size and proportions of the features. The workers here have reassembled the pieces from the shoulder down to the hand, and with a straight arm, we know that this was almost certainly a standing statue, and what a sight it must have been. Even 1,000 miles away from Aswan, to the north in the Nile Delta at the site of Tanis, Flinders Petrie found the remnants of a gigantic single-piece pink granite statue, stone that was sourced from Aswan. How was the original block for this statue moved 1,000 miles or 1,600 kilometers? I've covered this artifact and the topic of colossal statues in some depth in previous videos, and the links to them can be found below in the description. Regardless of whether this block in the quarry was destined to be an obelisk, a statue, or something else, it seems possible, if not probable, that it weighed in at considerably more than the unfinished obelisk's 1,200 tons. There are other aspects of this area that challenge the mainstream explanation. Firstly, this is supposed to be a harbour, where boats are docked in order to receive cargoes of stone. Presumably then, this block was removed before the area could be used as a harbour. Where was it taken, and how was it loaded? Where was it loaded? Of course, these questions are built on the assumption that this work was all done by the dynastic Egyptians. But what if it wasn't? What if this giant stone block was, instead, extracted in periods long before the dynastic Egyptians even started their own quarrying operations here? If this space was already here, it certainly makes it more convenient and plausible that it was a harbour. There's other evidence here that points to a great antiquity for this work, and it's drawn on the walls that were created after this huge stone was removed. Painted on the walls of the trench and faded by time are primitive depictions of what appear to be ostriches. Egypt, being located in the northern extreme of the African continent, certainly would have known of this species. Further down the wall remain the very faint traces, in blue, of what seem to be dolphins, which were known to inhabit the Nile River in the past. They're tough to see. I've done what I can to contrast them out in these images, but they are there. These primitive paintings aren't ignored by the standard model. Indeed, an attempt to explain them is given in the compulsory video. You're told that they were made by the workers in the quarry, presumably with all the spare time and energy they had after an 8 to 12 hour shift of pounding away with rocks. We know that the dynastic Egyptians used the quarry, there's no doubt of that, and not only do we see the wedge and chisel method that they certainly used, but there are also inscriptions carved into the stone in the typical dynastic style and very different to the ostrich paintings. The assertion that the painted ostriches were made by the workers has really nothing behind it beyond convenience and the desire to fit this evidence into the mainstream timeline. This isn't really how regular archaeology works. Archaeologists all over the world date and relate all sorts of artifacts by comparing them to others with known provenance, objects found in burials or the like that can have their age established through techniques like radiocarbon dating or even written records. Comparing and categorizing the particular style of artwork or artifacts is also a long-established method for dating. Take pottery, for example. Many academic textbooks have been written categorizing the various styles and forms of pottery and how they relate to different periods of ancient civilizations. This is an established archaeological method used at sites from China to South America to Egypt. This same method applies equally well to artwork and even writing. Styles of artwork can relate to specific periods. This technique is even used with the Egyptian hieroglyphic language itself. Some symbols, like that for water, changed in form over time, and thus the characters themselves can be used to determine if something was written in the Old, Middle, or New Kingdom. For whatever reason, however, this technique is conspicuously absent in the case of these paintings in the quarry. Perhaps because doing so would posit a fairly inconvenient conclusion, because these drawings of ostriches and dolphins were done in a style of artwork found to be prevalent in pre-dynastic times. For many thousands of years before the dynastic civilization ever started, primitive Mesolithic people were making artwork on objects like ostrich eggs or pottery, and there's many examples to be found. Just compare the paintings on the wall at Aswan to those made on this egg. They're almost identical, and it would be a brave scholar to make the case that they're not of the same form. This egg, and many more examples like it, come from established pre-dynastic burials and sites, going back thousands of years prior to the establishment of the dynastic Egyptian civilization. Entire textbooks have been written discussing pre-dynastic artwork in Egypt, a category that also includes the infamous, at least 7,000-year-old ostrich egg that appears to depict the pyramids next to the River Nile. If the paintings in the quarry are in fact pre-dynastic, this raises some significant challenges to the standard timeline for the quarry. Stating the blindingly obvious, the scooping and quarrying work had to have been done before the pre-dynastic paintings were ever made. How long before? We have no way of telling. It could have been thousands of years, we just don't know. Now we're on some ground that sits far outside of mainstream Egyptology, but you can begin to see the house of cards made by the assumptions in the standard model. The paintings had to be done by the workers, despite the evidence to the contrary, because the quarrying had to be done by the dynastic Egyptians, who therefore had to have created the scoop marks with nothing more than pounding stones, because we know that's all they had. It's like a chain made up of nothing but weak links and entirely unproven assertions. I've explained the mystery and significance of the scoop marks in a previous video, and I don't need to cover the same ground here, so check that one out if you're interested. The scoop marks have been puzzled over and theorized about by engineers and stoneworkers for more than 100 years now, professionals who know their crafts, and it's safe to say that very little credence is given to the whole pounding stone explanation. I, as well as many other people, including qualified engineers, think that the scoop marks are much better explained if we open our minds to the possibility of some unknown advanced form of technology. From this point, we can start to construct a new timeline, a new set of assumptions, but one's grounded in facts and evidence. I don't believe the dynastic Egyptians were using forms of advanced technology. They were a Bronze Age culture. They used copper and flint. They used wedge and chisel quarrying, none of which explain the scoop marks. Associated with the scoop marks is the unfinished obelisk, and not for a minute do I think that a Bronze Age culture, who didn't use the pulley or capstan, nor had access to strong metals, had the capability to lift and move single-piece stones of this size. Again, this is a topic I've explored in an earlier video on quarrying and logistics, so check that out if you need more explanation. So, if the dynastic Egyptians didn't make the scoop marks, and they weren't trying to remove 1,000-ton blocks of stone, and if the paintings in the quarry are from primitive pre-dynastic people, as the evidence suggests, who was responsible for the enormous works in the quarry? Could we be looking at the evidence for an alternative timeline, a longer one, involving a lost ancient civilization with advanced capabilities? There are multiple quarrying methods in evidence at the site, and it was certainly one used by the dynastic Egyptians. Are we looking at two separate industries here? on two very different timelines? Could the huge unfinished obelisk and the extraction from the harbour already have been ancient work, even for the dynastic Egyptians? If you've watched my scoop mark video discussing the obelisk, you'll know that it was buried in up to 7 meters of debris until the 1920s when excavations began, including some very large pieces that had to be broken up into 4 or more chunks in order to be removed. Similarly, in early surveys of the site made before it was excavated, the harbour area doesn't even show up. It was entirely buried in chip heaps and quarry rubble. Even if this was a truly ancient source of stone, we know the dynastic Egyptians continued quarrying operations here. As discussed, we can find lots of wedge and chisel marks made in the higher areas of the quarry and on the cliffs and sheer faces of previous extractions. Also, we know that none of the wedge and chisel signatures suggest that this method was used to remove stones of the same order of magnitude as those that were extracted via scooping. The massive single-piece blocks that were clearly extracted from here weren't just lying around on the surface either. You need to dig deeply into a granite outcrop to depths of 10, 11 meters or more to find solid enough granite for that purpose. You can still find many test holes at Aswan, which were dug using the scoop method, that were likely used to determine the quality of the granite. Surface granite might have been suitable for smaller pieces, but would not yield the huge solid chunks like those needed for statues, obelisks, columns, or even the massive boxes like those found in the Serapeum. So it's probably time for some speculation. What do I think was going on here? For the sake of argument, let's assume that there was an advanced, vastly ancient civilization in this area, who had access to technology capable of quarrying, extracting, and moving blocks of immense size, using techniques that left the scoop mark signature. They chose this spot, cut the top off a granite mountain, then began digging down, using test holes to determine the depth needed to find solid enough granite for their purposes. Then the extraction process began, and as we can see from the harbour, massive blocks of stone were removed. We have no way of knowing what was on top of this area originally, nor just how much stone was removed, but this is only one of many quarries in this granite-rich area. Work had started on the obelisk extraction, but, and as we can see at many ancient megalithic sites, the work was interrupted suddenly and violently, causing it to be abandoned and left unfinished. Even if the obelisk did eventually develop a crack as suggested without evidence by the standard model, blocks of stone would still have been cut from it. Instead, it was suddenly abandoned, and this is far from the only case of ancient megalithic work being left unfinished. The walls in the Assyrion at Abydos were left unsmoothed partway through the work. Across the world, in South America, we can find that the same thing occurred on the megalithic blocks of the ancient Coricancha in Cusco, Peru. We can find the same thing at Giza on the casing stones of the third pyramid. The job of smoothing out the granite was left unfinished. Partly machined boxes and lids were left abandoned in the hallways of the Serapeum of Saqqara. And much like the unfinished obelisk at Aswan, gigantic quarry blocks of limestone were left in place at Baalbek in Lebanon. These are only but a few of many such examples of unfinished ancient work on megalithic scales. I'd recommend checking out the Snake Bros' excellent unfinished presentation if you'd like to explore this concept further. The link is below. So, for whatever reason, perhaps cataclysm, perhaps social upheaval, perhaps violent climate change, something caused the work to stop, and suddenly. Then, time and nature began their inevitable attrition on these sites. The stone erodes, perhaps there was flooding, but an unknown number of eons go by. Mankind again slowly rises from the ashes of the Younger Dryas event, our most recent cataclysm. Primitive Neolithic man begins to find artifacts and sites, objects like stone vases and sites like this quarry. He leaves his mark here, painting the same depictions of life that were also painted onto hand-formed pottery or onto ostrich eggs. Eventually, over thousands of years and many generations, as populations increase, society congeals into what we know as the dynastic civilization, roughly around 3000 BC. With civilization comes the benefit of specialization, and quarrying work can begin anew in Aswan. This time, however, there is no advanced technology. The stone is worked with only primitive methods, attacking only the higher layers in the quarry, using known Bronze Age techniques like wedge and chisel, the signatures of which are still visible to tourists today. The remnants of the vastly ancient work, ancient even to the people of the Old Kingdom, are buried beneath the rubble and chip mounds of later work, and left waiting for us to uncover and decipher in today's time. As I said, it's pure speculation, but if I follow the evidence to where it leads, this possibility seems to fit. There is one last aspect of this area in the quarry that I want to discuss, and that is its use as a harbour. First of all, it's quite possible that this was indeed a harbour, an area flooded during the annual 3-month inundation of the Nile, docking boats for cargoes of stone to be delivered downstream. We know that stones were transferred this way by the ancient Egyptians, sometimes even objects like columns. There is a well-known depiction of a column being transported on a boat, carved in the Winnie's Causeway at Saqqara. If we examine this ancient drawing, we can see that it's a relatively small column, short and not very wide, a sense of scale given by the human figures standing next to it. It's really nothing at all like the giant 100-plus ton single-piece columns that we know existed at many Old Kingdom sites, as well as at sites like Tanis and Bastet. Yet this image is often used as a panacea-like response to any questions relating to transporting large objects by boat. The column in this depiction might have been 10 tons, let's say 15 tons, literally orders of magnitude distant from artifacts like the unfinished obelisk or the giant statues. The effort to move this column is vastly different than that required for something 100, 400, or let alone 1,000 tons. The drawing in the Winnie's Causeway is not sufficient to explain these cases, a topic I've dived into in my quarrying and logistics video. The link to that one is below too. So, while I don't dispute that this part of the Aswan quarry might well have been a harbour, where I run into problems with it is the frankly silly idea that it's in any way suitable for a vessel the size of one capable of transporting the 1,200-ton unfinished obelisk. We happen to have a relatively modern comparison to make here. In previous work, like the aforementioned logistics video, I've discussed the Russian Thunderstone. The Thunderstone is a giant granite boulder, perhaps originally a glacial erratic, weighing around 1,500 tons. It was transported in the late 1700s from the frozen tundra of Finland to the city of St. Petersburg in Russia, where it can still be found today, serving as the pedestal for a bronze statue of Peter I. I've previously talked about how it was moved across the ground. On a good day, 150 metres of progress was made, thanks to deeply anchored capstans used to drag a huge platform bearing the Thunderstone, via a movable rail system suspended on large bronze balls acting as bearings. What I haven't discussed before is how this giant stone was transported across the sea from Finland to the Russian coast. This project serves as an ideal comparison for the unfinished obelisk, as this was all done in the days before the benefits of electrical or hydraulic power and leverage. The Thunderstone was continuously carved as it was transported. In fact, the finished product today in St. Petersburg is only some 400 to 500 tons, so it's a fair assumption that its mass when it reached the Finnish coast was probably within 100 tons or so of that of the obelisk. It waited here for a full year on the edge of the Gulf of Finland, while a giant barge made specifically for it was constructed. It was eventually moved onto the barge, and attached to the barge were full-size warships, 2 on each side, in order to provide balance and displacement for the tremendous load. This whole contraption was then sailed to Russia, docked, and the Thunderstone's slow progress over land towards its final resting place could continue. So, we have a rough idea of what sort of arrangement was required to move a stone massing in excess of 1,000 tons in the 1700s. Take another look at the so-called harbour area of the Aswan quarry and try to fit those vessels into this space. It's not remotely feasible. Let's consider the unfinished obelisk, which, according to the standard model, was a project undertaken by Hatshepsut. They planned to cut this thing away from the bedrock, somehow lift it up into the air, and then transport it down the rocky hillside and load it onto a boat. In this scenario, just the displacement of water alone is immense. 1,200 tons of stone is equivalent to 1,200 cubic meters of water, and that's minus the mass of the vessel itself. Attempting this with any boat or ship incapable of such displacement would inevitably result in disaster. If you tried it, the ship would simply sink or just capsize, either way generating a massive thunk with the obelisk crashing to the harbour floor. There is simply no way you could fit an arrangement like that used for the Thunderstone in here. Indeed, there's zero evidence the dynastic Egyptians ever made barges or ships of the size that were necessary for such a load, as we did in the 1700s. I don't think the dynastic Egyptians were fools. They wouldn't have undertaken such a project without considering the logistical aspects of it. I just don't think they were capable of it, and as far as I know, there's no evidence to suggest that they were. As with so many of the ancient sites and artifacts found in this region, looking beyond the superficial, sometimes nonsensical explanations offered by the standard model reveals mysteries that we have yet to solve, and evidence that seems to fit a much longer and more complex model of our past. The dynastic civilization was mighty and lasted some 3,000 years, but the deeper I've delved into the details of what is left to us, the more it seems likely that there was much more going on here, at a far more distant time, by the hands, tools and technology of a long-lost ancient civilization. At least to me, it seems that the concept of inheritance, renovation and reuse played a significant role in what the dynastic civilization eventually became. And, as I've said before, this premise even matches what the dynastic Egyptians said about themselves and about their own history. Food for thought, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. Alright, well, I hope you found that look at a lesser seen area of the Aswan Quarry to be worthwhile. Just wanted to give a quick update on upcoming events and tours if you're interested in catching me live or visiting any of these amazing sites with me. In June 17th and 18th, I think only a week or two from when this video comes out, I'll be speaking live at the Cosmic Summit alongside a lot of other independent researchers as well as many scientists from the Comet Research Group. That's in Asheville, North Carolina, 17th and 18th of June. If you want to get a ticket to see the event live, there's still a few available, and also the live stream tickets will be available. There'll be a lot of audience interaction. It's going to be a good time, and you can replay the live stream at any time. Buying live stream tickets is a great way to support the channel. I get a small slice of those. You can find the link down below to take a look at tickets. It's howtube.com/unchartedx. In September of this year, 2023, I'll be joining Randall Carlson on his Mega Floods of the Ice Age tour through Montana. Really looking forward to that one. If you're interested in joining us on that trip, the link to that is also below in the description. Later in the year, I'm heading back to Egypt. I'm joining Yusuf Aswan on his excellent Primordial Egypt trip. That one runs from October 28th through November 10th of 2023. I think there's still a couple of tickets available for that. Again, the link to see it is below. And if you're interested in going to Egypt, but you can't make it in November, I do want to let you know that we put together our tour with the Snake Bros and Yusuf for February of next year. It's going to be a great tour. We were working hard on the itinerary. That one runs from the 7th to the 22nd of February 2024. It's 16 days. We've got 7 special permissions. And we've also got an optional extension to Lebanon to see Baalbek Temple, as well as a few other sites there. I'm very excited about getting over there. That runs at the end of the Egypt tour. It's February 22nd through the 26th This tour is already available for booking for channel supporters, members, and patrons, and I imagine in about 10 days or so I'll be making that publicly available, but if you're interested, please do check that one out. As always, I want to say just a massive thank you to everybody who does support my work through that value for value model. In particular, I want to say a special thank you to the executive producers and the associate executive producers for this episodes. In particular, Matt Beal for really supporting the channel in a big way, as well as investing in vases and going out and really helping our vase project move along. Thank you very much, Matt. Also, Tom Knoblauch, thank you so much for the support that you've given me, mate. It's much appreciated. I do try to run the channel through that value for value model. I don't really do sponsorships or those types of things. There's lots of ways that you can support the channel. I've got them all outlined on my website. It's unchartedx.com/support. Appreciate it if you could take a look if you're interested in returning some of that value to me. All right, guys, I hope everybody out there as well, and I'll catch you in the next one.